Please, please make it stop. Our guns are silent. Our worlds are yours. We surrender with no conditions. Just please, make it stop. Those were the last words of the Frenes Empire. You can still hear them echo in the void. Amidst the static of background cosmic radiation, you can still hear the desperation in the voice of their once emperor as he saw the stars fade on his domain. It's easy to dismiss the little things. It's easy to forget about them when there's void craft the size of small moons burning like torches in the night sky, ignited atmo venting from their broken hulls. It's easy to ignore the small details when oceans boil and stars shatter in the anvil of war. But it's the little things that what gets you in the end. The INS Pale was such a little thing. A relic, built shortly after the Terran age of unification on the surface of Terra herself, instead of some orbital shipyard. 100 meters from stern to bow, less than 30 from port to starboard, and light enough to reach escape velocity under the power of her ancient chemical engines. Originally built as a small cargo freighter, meant to transport liquid water from Terra to the pale wastes of Luna, back when Terra still had water. She had no weapon systems, no DEWs, no kinetic launchers, no ballistics. She didn't even have a grav drive, as the technology was still experimental at the time of her construction. By all means, she should be in pieces, her body broken and recycled 1,000 times over. Or maybe she should be under the bright exhibition lights of a museum. Instead, she lay abandoned and forgotten in the drift amidst the stars. Her voyage in the current of interstellar gravity had brought her in orbit of Lyssa, a gas giant in the edge of imperial space, slowly sinking into her gravity well, waiting to be consumed by the thick yellow clouds that covered the world's upper atmosphere. From where the INS Charon was, she looked like nothing more than a smudge. "Is that it?" Willard, the captain of the Charon, asked. "Is that the vessel that has you and the rest of the Cryptea agency so excited? The void ship that we will toss to the Frenes war navy to tear them apart? The void ship that will be our salvation?" "Oh, trust me, Captain," Agent Langley answered coldly. "That vessel will be nobody's salvation. How long until we can board it?" "One of our away crews is attaching the external thrusters on it right now. They should be done in a couple of hours. Then, a couple of hours more until the tethers are attached and we pull her close. After that, it's a matter of wizarding the airlock protocols of the Charon to play nice with that ancient tech. I don't know how long that's going to take." Willard flicked his prosthetic hand in front of the holoscreen, zooming in on the video feed of the INS Pale. "So, tell me, why do you need my Charon to tow that relic? Why am I here in the middle of nowhere with you, when the rest of the strike force heirs is fighting in the front lines?" "Tell me, Captain, do you know how extensive the archives of Terra are?" Langley asked back. "Sure," the captain answered. "All records, all books, municipal plans, vessel registrations, everything is recorded and kept in the archives." "There's entire legions of scribes who dedicate their lives from the moment they reach adulthood to the time they breathe their final breath into recording everything in the Imperium, into those archives. The data forts that contain them span entire ocean floors across multiple worlds. There's backup storage in orbit, and in secret locations in the middle of interstellar void. We even have backups of the backups, the form of QR codes carved on slabs of titanium, in barren moons most don't even know exist, in case everything else fails. The sum of Terran knowledge, from the age of unification to now, is kept in those archives, and the Cryptea is the only organization in the entire Imperium that has access to them. Not even the Imperator himself has access to what we have. Amidst those archives is a certain record, a certain manifest, the manifest of the Pale's last shipment before she went dark, and yet, strangely enough, the Pale herself isn't in our records." "The scribes made a mistake? Or maybe the Cryptea did," said Willard. "How can there be a manifest for a vessel's cargo but not the vessel itself?" Willard was confused. Langley tilted his head at Willard, indicating that he should know better than to ask such questions. What was she carrying? Captain Willard asked another question, fully knowing the futility of doing so. Langley only gave him a knowing look in return. Let me know as soon as we can board the vessel, Captain. And remember, only my team has access. The alloy of the ancient vessel strained as the Charon's tethers started to pull on it. If it weren't for the cold vacuum of the void, you could hear the hull scream in agony as it fought to stay in one piece. The claws of the INS Charon pulling it one way, the gravity of Lissa pulling it the other. Slowly, the giant winches buried deep within the Charon's engineer decks won the battle, pulling the ancient Pale into the Charon's embrace. The thrusters activated, gently guiding the vessel toward one of the many umbilical connectors, like a sea ship drifting inside a safe harbor. From the observation windows overlooking the umbilical, the Pale's age really showed. A fuselage scarred by micrometeorite impacts and scorched by centuries upon centuries of cosmic radiation, the very lettering of its name almost faded away. Beneath the scars and the scorch marks, however, there was something more peculiar. The void ship looked off, as if not everything was exactly right with it. It resembled a vessel of its era, sure, but the details were wrong, as if hastily copied, and then copied again and again, the errors accumulating with each transcription. The vessel was warped. As the umbilical connected and the protocols of the two vessels synchronized, a cacophony of low-atmosphere warnings blared through the PA system of the vessel, and the airlocks begrudgingly cycled. Shades of orange warning light bathed Langley and his crew, as the thrusters of their exosuits pushed them inside the Pale. Mere meters from the entrance, and the pitch black already swallowed them whole. Even the beams of their flashlights could only carve out a tiny bit of visibility from within the darkness, each photon fighting against the black. Willard only had access to the telemetry of Langley and his team's exosuits. No video, no audio, only their heartbeats, the condition of the environment surrounding them, and a host of other miscellaneous metadata. The heartbeats were stable, as one would expect from trained agents of the Cryptea. But the environmental scans showed something different. They picked up heat emanating from the vessel, even though all its systems had gone cold for millennia. They picked up fluctuations in the pressure around them, even though the vessel's atmo had been vented through countless holes that perforated the length of it. Most strange of all, the exosuit's telemetry brought back geometric data. According to them, the interior of the Pale stretched for 102 meters, from stern to bow. External scans of the void ship had measured it at exactly 100. Willard went through the readings again and again, across all the suits of Langley's crew. One faulty suit was a possibility, 2 was unlikely, but 5 different exosuits bringing back the same erroneous readings was impossible. And yet, so were the readings themselves. From the console that tracked their locations, Willard saw them split up. 2 of them headed to the bridge, the rest headed for the engineering deck. None of them were heading to the cargo bay. Willard wanted to raise Langley on the radio, ask them where they were going, what they were looking for. What the hell did they intend to bring back from that cursed ship? But he knew the only answer he would get would be silence. Suddenly, the alarm on 3 of the X-suits went off, the suits that had headed towards the engineering deck. Elevated heart rates, erratic breathing, cortisol levels spiking, adrenaline too. It seemed like all 3 of them were having a heart attack at the same time. More than that, the gravitic readings were going crazy too, bouncing between several G differences from one moment to the next. He had only seen these kinds of readings on vessels that were about to initiate a grav jump. Before he could dispatch a medic squad to go after the Cryptea agents, a call came from Langley's radio. Prepare medical assistance at the airlock. Do not board the Pale. I repeat, do not board the Pale. Captain Willard obeyed Langley's orders, and yet, every second that passed, and the wounded weren't appearing in the airlock, he considered harder and harder exactly how bad it would be to get court-martialed for disobeying a Cryptea agent. Eventually, Willard saw 2 figures emerging from the ship. The darkness that enveloped them was now spitting them out. Between them, they were carrying their unconscious colleague. The medical team quickly laid him on a stretcher, tying him down for transportation to the infirmary. Willard managed to catch a glimpse of the agent's exosuits patches while the medics prepared them for transport. He had to look again and again to make sure he was seeing right. The patches were wrong. Not only were they wrong, but the letters and numbers on the agent's insignia were scrambled. Soon after, the other two agents appeared. Langley was one of them. Put him in isolation. Only my team talks to him. Willard flew at Langley at the sound of orders. What the hell is in there? He almost shouted. Hell, came the distorted answer from Langley's suit voice modulator. I should put you all in quarantine, Willard said, spite sharpening his voice. Scuttle the damned thing. You will do no such thing, Captain. Langley's distorted voice continued. Not because you know the Crypteia overrides your authority, but because you yourself have seen how this war goes. You've seen our legions shatter. You've seen the sword of Azrael, the flagship strike force Apollyon, crash on the surface of Lequin Delta. You've seen the burning ruins of Hypatia sprawl. You know what lies beyond that airlock is our only hope, even if you don't know what it is. Captain Willard stood silent. The Crypteia agent was right. The entire deck is off limits to everyone, including the Crypteia, he announced to the gathered crewmen. I hope you have everything you needed from that ship, Agent Langley, because you aren't getting anywhere near it again. Langley nodded. We have what we need for now. You will know it when we need to cross the Pale's threshold again, and you yourself will open the locks for us. Over the coming days, the INS Charon moved away from Lyssa's gravity well to where it was safe for them to grav jump away from the star system. During that time, Willard found himself drawn to the relic of a vessel. At first, he would simply spend time gazing at it. Minutes at first, then hours. Then the entire day would pass and he would be transfixed at its sight, observing it from the engineering deck near the umbilical the Pale was attached to. Even as the artificial lights dimmed to stimulate nightfall on the Charon. As days passed, the vessel seemed to almost beckon at him, pulling him towards it. He studied her every detail, every mark, every bolt and every visible weld on her hull, every visible distortion she had suffered, every subtle way it was altered from its original form. Sometimes, it seemed as if that distortion extended beyond the Pale's hull, like the light of the stars around it was bending, like the void craft was a miniature black hole, tugging and pulling at the very fabric of space and time. It was at those times when the captain could almost hear it, the voice of the Pale, calling to him in a language without words, telling him to get inside, to cross the threshold of its airlock. With every day that passed, the voice grew louder. He nearly heeded that voice. More than once, he found himself making his way through the engineering deck, past the station guards, and to the umbilical connector. Each time he stopped a few steps away from the airlock's control panel, something within him screaming at him not to go further. Something primordial and louder than the voice of the Pale, though every time, it seemed that the Pale's call grew louder and the voice within him grew fainter. There was without a doubt something about the Pale, something beyond Willard's ability for explanation. Yet at first glance, it was such a small and insignificant thing. An old and tiny vessel, barely worth the title of void ship, towing it along barely even affected the Charon's fuel consumption. When he wasn't near the vessel, Willard spent his time in the med bay, outside the comatose agent's room. Willard couldn't talk to him even if he wanted, as he had slipped into a full coma since he was pulled out of the Pale. Instead, Willard spent his time with him combing through the medical readings. Most of them made absolutely no sense. His heart fluctuated between beating normally and beating at heart attack levels. The various screenings of his blood returned results that couldn't be exhibited in a living human. Yet more strangely of all, his brainwave readings would often appear to be double, as if there were two brains trapped inside his one skull. Any questions regarding the agent's condition were met by the rest of the Crypteia with condescending and fake assurances that he was fine. The effects of the distortion of the Pale didn't confine themselves to its immediate vicinity and to the agent. However, like a disease, the distortion, the Pale, spread across the Charon. With each passing day, the crew grew more restless, irritable, and almost paranoid. More and more amongst them couldn't get restful sleep for long enough to dream. and those that did whispered of things they saw when they were in their bunks. Dreams of uncanny and prophetic visions of grotesque and obscene fates, dreams that would wake them screaming and panting in their sweat-covered sheets, dreams of the universe bleeding. It wasn't long until the hallucinations followed them in their waking life, an altered image on the mirror, an instrument reading that made no sense, an object appearing where it shouldn't be, a hallway that was slightly longer or slightly shorter with each passage. Disorientation set in, with crew members finding themselves down dead-end corridors that weren't there before, opening doors to bulkheads that seemed to only now materialize out of nothing. Eventually, nothing seemed right anymore, even the texture of their skin on their bones, the taste of their gums on their tongue, the features on their own faces. The reflections on the mirror no longer seemed quite right, no longer made sense. Soon, the irritability and paranoia took physical form. The hallucinations and the dreams seemed to affect the Charon at a geometric rate. The crew stationed on the decks in the closest proximity to the Pale suffered the most adverse effects, those that had to sleep and work closer to it. Amongst them, fights broke out over the most minuscule thing, duties went unobserved, and the only threats of punishment from the officers that were still clinging to their sanity kept a semblance of order. Those further away still suffered the symptoms of the Pale's distortion, albeit in a less severe manner. The dreams were less frequent and the visions less severe, but for them too the whispers grew louder, as they had for the crews of the lower decks. Perhaps that was even worse in a sense, having a clear vision of what was to come and no control over it. It was only the 4 Crypteia agents that seemed wholly unaffected by what was happening. That cursed void ship, the Pale. It was all because of the Pale. Wherever it had traveled to, whatever it had brought back, it was tearing at the minds of the crew, driving them insane. Willard was certain of as much, yet there was nothing he could do. He had envisioned cutting it loose from the Charon's tethers, letting it to drift into the void, or turning the Charon's guns on it, transforming it into stardust. Then there were other thoughts that he felt didn't belong to him, thoughts that he had to protect the Pale, keep it safe, alive. He saw it as his child, as part of him. A vortex of duality clouded his mind into inaction, leaving the Pale to continue to fester and spread its poison on the Charon. By the time the Charon was in position to engage its grav drives and jump, the crew was on the brink of descending to anarchy. Paranoia was the law. Shadows whispered in the ears of crewmen as visions of hell itself flickered on the edge of their eyes. Some decided to end it on their own terms, hanging themselves from the bulkheads, slicing across their wrists in bloody pools, or simply turning their guns on themselves. For the rest, violence had become inevitable, and brutal skirmishes had begun to break out amidst the crew on the lower decks. Service weapons, knives, crude makeshift spears, anything sufficiently heavy to crush through a Terran skull. All was utilized to lethal effect. Executions had become a standard form of discipline. The sounds of gunshots echoed every few hours, and the corridors of the engineering decks were stained in red and coagulated brain matter that had become too thick to be washed away. The violence, too, was inching closer to the bridge at a geometric rate. It was a matter of time before the bridge crew was either assaulted by the fermenting anarchy of the lower decks, or they succumbed to the madness themselves. Captain Willard, a haggard and sleepless shell of his normal self, managed to drag himself from the observation window that overlooked the Pale and to the Charon's bridge to oversee the process of the jump. Agent Langley stood beside him. "Powering up the plasma shields," came the voice of a bridge crewman. "Spinning the Einstein coils," came another. "Main grav drive is up and powered. Auxiliary grav drives, power up." The callouts continued. "Diagnostics are wrong," a voice from further down the bridge said. One officer rose from his station and stood at attention in front of Captain Willard. "Captain, systems diagnostics are indicating malfunction. Protocol recommends postponing the jump." The officer's voice was strained. He was still sane enough to know the protocol, and to know when to ignore it. He knew that whatever was happening to him and the rest of the crew needed to stop, and that the only way to do so would be to finish the mission, to jump out of the system and into hostile territory where the Pale would finally be released. Still,
Duty demanded that he recited protocol to his captain, and so he did. Willard looked over to Langley. He already knew what the agent would say. He himself knew that the jump couldn't be postponed. All Langley did was slightly nod. Malfunctions are acceptable during current circumstances. Take us into the jump, he said. The bridge officer walked back to his station and gave a final set of orders to his men. Moments later, the jump initiated. The stars around the vessel were swallowed by the void, and reality itself began to collapse, the force of gravity magnified by entire orders of magnitude. Even with the Einstein coils compensating for the flux in the gravity, everyone on board the Charon still felt like the thumb of God himself was pressing down on them. The black of the void itself disappeared, and the Charon became enveloped by true nothingness. No colors outside the observation windows, no signals from the instruments. Pure non-existence. Pure liminality. The Charon was now in the jump, the space between space. It was the first time Willard noticed it, how absolute the nothing was during the jump. It was the first time Willard noticed anything at all during a jump. Normally, perception of time and space was dulled for the duration of a jump, a fraction of a blink of an eye, and you were in another star system, hundreds of thousands of light years away. A standard physiological response all sentients seemed to share, not just Terrans. Yet this time, he could sense everything. The nothing slowly turned to something. The visions of the horrible fates to come, drenched in blood and fire and burning meat. The dreams and the hallucinations of the crew all came into stunning reality. Willard saw himself unraveling and folding back in on himself countless times over. His very being now was a never-ending fractal. All his selves, all the realities, those that were possible and those that were not, mixing and coalescing into one. The glimpses of unreality he had peeked at in the days past were now engulfing his consciousness, filling up every corner. The firmament was finally torn, and all the horror was flooding in. All at once, a billion stars bled and screamed in the void as they collapsed into a single instance. Then, with the same jarring suddenness, the nothingness faded away and reality came back into stark focus. They had dropped out of the jump and into the periphery of the besieged Enceladus star system. Willard thought he would scream his lungs raw. He thought he could tear out his own eyes with his bare hands. Instead, he, along with everyone else on the bridge, found himself utterly unable to move, to speak. He simply stood there, looking at the silent stars and the cold void. "It is time," Langley said to Willard, the first voice he had heard back in reality. "It is time to cross the threshold, to end the mission." Nodding was all Willard could manage. With heavy steps, he accompanied Langley and his team of Krypteia agents down the corridors of the Charon. A strange calm had befallen the vessel. Amidst the scorch marks on the walls and the dried blood underfoot, it seemed almost surreal to not hear gunshots or paranoid screams for a while. "Why?" Willard finally managed to ask. "Why is this happening? The madness, the death. I have trusted in the Imperium, in the Krypteia, in the mission for long enough. I need to know." Every word left with agony from Willard's lips. His mind was still clouded by the visions of what could not be. "Do you know how grav drives work?" Langley asked. "Do you know even the basics of the mechanisms that propel your void ship through space and time?" Willard considered the question for a moment. He knew the theory behind it. Grav drives increase the gravitation forces surrounding the vessel, amassing energy that trends toward infinity around it. The concentration of energy punches a hole through the universe, allowing the ship to slide between space to where it needs to be. But the mechanics behind it, do you know how they work? I'm sure you know the mechanics behind the operation of the nuclear reactor at the core of the Charon. But do you know the mechanics behind the operation of its grav drive? Willard pondered once more before answering. "No," he finally said. "That's because nobody does," Langley answered back. Not the Imperium of Terra, not the Phrenes Empire, not even the Sildari Ascendancy. The galaxy makes use of them, can manufacture them, or a version of them that suits their needs, but nobody really understands them. This technology is inherited, gifted, or even stolen. But to our knowledge, it is never invented. Like a force of nature, all star civilizations eventually come into its possession, albeit nobody knows how or why. Willard had never thought about it before, but it was true. He had received training on how every system of a modern voidcraft worked as part of his duties as captain. He knew the mechanisms that governed the operation of directed energy weapons, the mechanics of kinetic throwers, ballistic missiles, point defense cannons, active ballistic denial, plasma shielding, nuclear reactors, void thrusters. But when it came to the grav drive, he only held a vague idea of the theory behind it. So did everyone else he knew, be it a fellow captain, officer, or engineer. Our first grav drives were stolen ones, Langley continued. We salvaged them from the voidcraft of the Ish-Atar that invaded Terra during the first contact. We reverse-engineered them and produced crude copies of this technology we could scarcely even comprehend. During the prototyping stage, we made several iterations of the grav drive, installed them as auxiliary components in the engineering of cargo freighters, and sent them on test voyages. Most of the time, our alterations to the grav drive technology failed to operate entirely. Others, it caused catastrophic failure of the systems, completely wrecking the test void craft. Exactly once, it resulted in the vessel that was carrying it to completely disappear. The INS Ashen had made it to the Oort cloud of the Sol system on its conventional engines. When it engaged its prototype version of the grav drive, for the first few moments, everything seemed normal. Energy readings were nominal. The Einstein coils were engaged. It looked like it would be a successful test. Then, in the blink of an eye, readings went haywire, gravitic fluctuations several thousand times higher than they should be, and an energy burst resembling the beam of a pulsar star were detected for exactly 13 seconds before everything returned back to normal. A garbled distress signal managed to be broadcast from the ship, and then nothing. The Ashen was gone. Searches were conducted, of course. The nascent Imperium sent drones using more conventional versions of the grav drives to the intended target systems of the test voyage, as well as to the star system near it. Multispectral scans of all sorts were deployed, from searching for the grav drive signature to scrapping through the particle background of that area of the galaxy, looking for the outline of the Ashen's hull. Nothing was ever discovered. The test was deemed a failure, and the Imperium moved on. At the same time, however, something interesting was happening on our mining colonies on Pluto and on the asteroid belt. The population was becoming paranoid, reporting strange dreams and hallucinations. Reality itself was twisting and bending in front of them, until the situation devolved into chaos. As you can imagine, as you have seen for yourself, a population suffering from mass paranoia has only one way to go, and that is down. The Imperium tried to quell the situation using regular means. The infant versions of the Astral Legions we know today are deployed under the guise of suppressing a xenophilic rebellion. In reality, they were supposed to put down a population gone mad. Alas, insanity is contagious as it seems, because those troops deployed began exhibiting the same exact symptoms of insanity. The situation spiraled to the point where the Imperium had no solutions, except for the ultimate solution. We turned half of Pluto into glass, wiped several dozen asteroid colonies from existence, but the madness had finally stopped. You mean to tell me that what happened here also happened then? Willard choked on his words. There is no cure other than euthanasia? Hardly, Langley answered. The grav drive of the Pale was dormant. What we experienced here was but the residual effects of its activation almost 1,000 years ago. Every time a grav drive is activated, it tears through reality. Our grav drives make a tiny prick through its veil, just large enough for a voidcraft to pass through. The prototype on the Ashen, on the other hand, ripped reality to pieces for a territory of several million cubic kilometers of the void. When the hole is small, it patches itself back up. Nothing slips between the cracks.
But when it's big enough, it can't be mended so easily. And the things that are contained on the other side, the things that turn sane men to madness, they come pouring in.
And do you plan to activate it again, on the Enceladus system? The captain asked.
That is exactly correct. The Enceladus system, then the Boreal system, then the Fenathuk, all the way to the heart of the Phrenis Empire,
Langley declared, excitement barely concealed in the tone of his voice. Still, I don't understand why. Why did it have to be the Pale? Why did we have to recover it?
Willard was now on the verge of tears, as reality of what had happened, of what was still happening, settled in. Almost 1,000 years ago, the INS Ashen disappeared from our galaxy, never to be found again, leaving a rippling tidal wave of insanity in its wake. In its place, in the system of where its test voyage was supposed to conclude, the INS Pale appeared. The Ashen and the Pale are unique. Nothing like them has ever been constructed before or since, even though we have tried. The grav drives in them, one constructed on our Terra, our reality, and the other in a Terra parallel to this one, are unique. Their design couldn't be replicated, their construction couldn't be copied, but it could be altered. When we boarded the Pale, we modified its grav drive, powered it down just enough so we could skip along the surface of our reality before crossing the veil. We have calculated the jumps needed. We will skip along the Phrenian strategic star system, and then we will see what the crew of the INS Ashen saw all those years ago.
So we use it as a weapon then. Willard understood, finally in front of the airlock. He felt the pull of the Pale again, its beckoning, its whispers. Its malignancy still gripped him, like a cancer he was all too familiar with. The dissonance gripped him once again. He wanted to cut it off, be rid of it. And at the same time, he felt like he would be amputating a part of himself. Langley grabbed his shoulder.
I know, he said. I feel it too, hear it, the whispers.
Then how? Willard asked. How do you resist it? Langley shook his head.
I do not. None of us do.
He gestured at his team.
When our ancestors first discovered the power of the atom millennia ago, they did not know what its energy could do to them. They did not know of the radiation that could break them apart molecule by molecule, that could strip their flesh off their bones. The bomber pilots that first deployed those atomic weapons didn't know what they were risking with every flight. We do. We have accepted its call, and we will ride it to the other side.
Langley stepped through the impenetrable darkness of the Pale's threshold once more, along with the rest of the Krypteia, for the final time. The airlock cycled close. The Pale's engine sparked to life, and then, as if it was just any other vessel, it pulled away from the Charon and into the void. Willard watched as the Pale accelerated on its ancient thrusters towards the Phrenian Navy blockade on Enceladus 3-B. Still transfixed to the vessel, still the faint whispers of it clawing at his mind, he tapped into the broad-range communications of the blockading enemy fleet. They were amused at the Pale's sight, a tiny thing, a relic, insignificant and ignorable, until, in the blink of an eye, the scans went haywire. Energy readings at the level of a pulsar star's beam were detected, and gravity fluctuated beyond comprehension for a vast territory of the void. And suddenly, the INS Pale was gone. The Charon stayed there, on the edge of the Enceladus system, listening to the frantic transmissions of the Phrenian Navy as they descended into madness. They made random pleads to God and deities they hardly even believed in, begged for mercy, for the insanity to stop, for the dreams to cease, for the whispers to go quiet. Then they begged for more, as they gave into it and embraced the madness, the visions from beyond the veil of this reality. As they tore at each other like rabid animals, Willard listened to the sound of gunshots across open communications channels. Then the sound of flesh being rent apart when weapons were not enough to sate the frenzy. Their void craft opened fire on each other, their gun crews maniacally laughing as they tore each other to pieces, even as their burning vessels streaked across the sky of Enceladus 3-B in brilliant plumes of red. They continued laughing. It wasn't long before reports of similar frantic and insane transmissions started appearing across Phrenian space. The entire Frenius Empire was descending into primordial chaos and insanity. First, the fleets and the orbital stations in the void. Then, the transmissions would come from the surface of their world, as entire cities flooded their streets with the blood of their brothers, their sisters, their sons, and daughters.
Please, please make it stop. Our guns are silent. Our worlds are yours. We surrender with no conditions. Just please, make it stop.
Was the last transmission from their capital before the pleas for an end to the madness were drowned out by the slaughter and the laughter, the unending laughter.